Hello and welcome to WightWanderer. I'm Jack, and you join me today on a bitterly cold day out in Yarmouth on the northwest coast of the island. One of the smallest towns in the UK, and in fact the oldest recorded town on the Isle of Wight. But today I'm not here to visit Yarmouth, as pretty as it is. I'm actually here to have a look at an old military fort. A fort which once had its own railway. The area around Yarmouth has long been known for its naval presence. Being the oldest town, naturally, it also has one of the earliest harbours on the island. But the topic of today's video is positioned across the estuary to the west, a place boasting a significant and rather unique military presence. I'm of course talking about Fort Victoria, a remnant of the Napoleonic Wars and constant threat of invasion from France. Its footprint though was there way before the turn of the 19th century. In fact, it goes way back to the reign of Henry VIII. The first defensive fort in the vicinity was actually established in 1525, when Sir James Worsley, the founder of the Appuldurcombe family, built Worsley's Tower, a structure octagonal in shape which for 20 years stood alone on this stretch of coastline. The structure itself, regrettably, has long been lost to erosion, but luckily the fortifications which quickly succeeded it are still to a varying degree observable on the landscape, many of which were built under the watchful eye of Henry VIII. in order to defend England at the time, fearing invasion from both the Spanish and the French. During this time, Hurst Castle was constructed in order to safeguard the western passage of Solent waters. But this time also saw the construction of many fortifications here on the Isle of Wight, the most notable being in this area, Yarmouth Castle, constructed in 1547. More importantly for this video though, it also saw the construction of the first defensive structure on the site of what we now know as Fort Victoria. The first fort on site was actually called Sharpnode, and it was primitive in design, consisting of an earth platform protected by wooden planking. By no means then an impenetrable structure, but still categorised as a defensive fortification. It saw little use and was already in a state of dilapidation 10 years after it was built in 1557. In 1588 then, it was both inadequate and outdated when a new Armarda invasion threat appeared. A new fort then was erected, and this one, though still made of timber, was a much more impressive and substantial edifice, the shape of which appeared to mimic a five-pointed star. The new fort was named Carrie Sconce after the governor of the island at the time, Sir George Carey. A sconce, or the word sconce itself, actually derives from the Dutch word of the same pronunciation, meaning a fort of multiple bastions. And a bastion, just in case you were wondering, is the part of the fort constructed at an angle or a point in order to allow defensive fire in multiple directions. You could argue then that Carrie Sconce, being star-shaped in nature, was in fact just one big bastion. One big bastion it may have been, but however you categorise it, the fort itself never saw much action. The Armada did invade, but were almost immediately overpowered by the English fleet out of Plymouth. Therefore they swiftly retreated back to the shores of Calais. After this, it's difficult to tell what exactly happened to the fort. But a survey in 1623, almost 40 years after the Armada, stated that the building was abandoned and returning to nature. During the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the mid-1600s, little was mentioned of the site, assuming that other forts in the area were given priority. It appears then that for 200 years, Carrie Sconce was left in a state of decay and slumber. By the early 1800s though, them damn Frenchies were at it once again, this time under the command of a young ambitious chap called Napoleon Bonaparte, who would of course become the country's most prolific military leader. This then was no joke, and up and down the shores of Blighty, old fortifications were revived and thrown back into service, once again anticipating a major French invasion.
This then led to the revival of the site we now know as Fort Victoria, though not initially as a standalone fort. It would seem in 1805 our fortress was in use once again, but only as a battery with a mere 3 guns at hand, intended to act as cover fire in protection of the nearby Yarmouth castle. During the war though, it once again saw little use, and after 1815, upon defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo, our site, now known as Sconce Point, became redundant once more, this time briefly masquerading as a coastguard station.
The defeat of Napoleon though wasn't the end of the unrest. France was still unsettled, and the threat, or the fears of an enemy invasion, was still rife amongst the British people. One of those people was none other than Queen Victoria herself, who in 1852 demanded the restructuring of all forts along the south coast of England. A new fort then was to be built on this spot, one bearing the name of the monarch herself.
However, despite the persistence of the monarch and the somewhat illusionary threats, the fort wasn't actually finished until 1855, by which time fears had somewhat subsided. The fort itself was initially designed with an elevated section above the gateway, but oddly when the complex was actually built, this detail was left off the finished structure. The new fort was built bang up to date, with ever-advancing military design, including overhead protection for gunners, encased in a brick chamber, whereas previous arrangements had seen defensive guns placed out in the open. It would seem that on the whole, the construction of the new fortification was hailed as a success. But much like the old saying goes, everyone's a critic.
Now the fort itself has actually changed somewhat in appearance over the years. Indeed, the section that still remains is only a small part of the original structure, as you can see in this photograph, which shows the extent of the surrounding buildings. Almost as soon as it was built though, its design was heavily criticised. And in 1858, in the midst of the Crimean War, the army also had their doubts. So what they did is they took their own ships, they sailed out onto the Solent, they turned around and then they fired upon their own fort. Ironically, this would actually be the only time that Fort Victoria was fired upon in anger.
Now I'm going to level with you here. The development of Fort Victoria over time is so complex and convoluted that it would take at least 2 more videos to explain everything in detail. I could talk about its revolutionary seesaw searchlights and other advancements in gun technology, but I'll leave all that to someone who is much more qualified to speak on the subject. After all, I'm just a railway nerd.
So what about the tramway then? Well, in 1886, developments were actually made to the fort in order to make it more suitable for its new lease of life as a mine depot. And in doing so, a pier just east of the site was extended in order to land goods. Along with this, the troops needed a way of transporting these hazardous weapons from the pier to the barracks and the stores. And so they constructed a railway.
This railway was built to an 18-inch gauge and developed purely for the transport of these mines. Constructed by the Submarine Mining Company, who saw Fort Victoria as the perfect base to store both loaded and empty cases for military use in the late 19th century. At the time, the fort itself was manned by the Royal Engineers, and they remained there using the site as a testbed for military training exercises until World War I. As far as the tramway is concerned, the layout was much more elaborate than a simple point-to-point single-line affair.
Now, even though the distance between the pier and the fort over there isn't actually that far. The tramway network itself was actually quite extensive. So the first spur would have come off the pier to about here, where there would have been a turntable. That turntable would have then served another spur heading down that way towards the front of the barracks. The pier line, though, would have continued up here to about this point, where there would have been another turntable and another spur heading towards the fort, through the buildings into the storage areas. The original line then of the pier would have continued and curved left through those buildings there.
The spur to the fort itself had multiple branches. The first one being a loop line serving an empty mine case store located about here. This is the location of the first section of remaining tramway. The next turntable was situated about here, serving a spur heading to the store for empty electro-contact mines. The main spur then followed the inner contours of the casemates. The next branch being a loop diverting into the building at this point, serving the first store for loaded mines. It then re-emerged about where the gift shop and museum is now situated. The tramway then looped a full 180 in order to enter the second loaded mine store, where today another section of track remains. A small reminder of this once rather extensive network of narrow gauge lines. After World War I, the Royal Artillery replaced the Royal Engineers on site. And even though these were turbulent times, the main purpose of the fort itself was for military exercises. This time for training coastal gunners.
In the interwar years though, Fort Victoria actually played a part in a very interesting and far-fetched experiment when a young scientist, a German called Gerhard Zucker, invented what could only be described as a mail-carrying rocket service. Now this may sound like something straight out of a sci-fi novel, but Gerhard himself actually set up a syndicate, a company, in order to pioneer rocket mail services across the Channel. Naturally though, the service needed to be tested before it could go ahead. And so he decided to come down here to the Solent and use it as a test bed. He set up his rocket over there in Lymington, the other side of the water, and then decided that Fort Victoria would be the perfect landing spot.
On the 19th of December 1934, the young German inventor fired his rocket, capable of carrying 600 letters, aiming for Fort Victoria. Unfortunately, shortly after launch, a large gust of wind took hold of the rocket. And though it did fly, it didn't exactly reach its target, crash landing in the middle of Key Haven marshes.
Apparently our young scientist had so much unfounded faith in his experiment that he actually used 600 real letters due to be delivered to people in his rocket. So naturally, when they landed on the marshes, he had to go and get them himself and then deliver those rather sodden letters by hand to the recipients.
Exercises at Fort Victoria continued until the end of national service in 1960. Presumably by this point, the tramway was long out of use. By 1962, the use for a fort on the site had declined, and the cost of maintaining such a structure, one now essentially benign, became a major issue. In '67, the building was pretty much derelict, and 2 years later, the main fort was demolished, leaving only the casemates in place. This section, of course, still remains today, many of the arches now having been converted into shops and other conveniences. If you are ever in the vicinity and fancy learning about some local history, I can highly recommend a visit. However, unlike myself, perhaps wait until it gets a bit warmer. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and if you have, then please do consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.